Hi, good morning everyone, and welcome to 2023's Retail Consumer Insight webinar. So today's webinar is going to be looking at the impact of the cost of living crisis and consumer attitudes towards the industry. I'm Steve Evans and I'm the Lead Consumer Insight Manager at AHDB. And for the next hour, we're going to be taking you through some of the latest trends that we're seeing and also having a little bit of chat with the managers and analysts that have worked on the data. So if you can pop on to the next slide, please. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The presentation and this session will be recorded. Slides will be made available to everyone after completing a very short feedback form. We really welcome that feedback. It helps us shape future content and also to know how you found today's session. In today's session, we're joined by three speakers. We've got Vanessa, Charlotte, and Carrie. Vanessa and Charlotte are from our Retail and Consumer Insight team, and Carrie heads up the marketing team within AHDB. Vanessa and Charlotte are going to take you through some of the attitudes that we're seeing in the industry and looking at the impact that's having on consumption in the marketplace, as well as picking out some of the opportunities that we see in the reputational landscape, such as health, environment, buying British, and animal welfare. And Carrie's going to give you some examples about how we use this evidence within AHDB and some of the marketing activity the AHDB team are up to out in the industry. You can pop onto the next slide, please, Christian. I'm not sure how many of you might be aware of our team's activity. I know it's great to see so many familiar names on the sign-up sheets, but there's also some new names in there, so it's fantastic to see that. So thank you for signing up. We're a team of 5, and we've also got Kim on maternity leave, who would have normally been on these types of sessions you might have seen in past years. But the team look at retail and consumer trends, and we're here to work with levy payers and the industry to make sure we understand and can adapt to consumer behaviour and understanding buying behaviours. There's lots of content on the AHDB website that we would very much like you to go and have a little look at afterwards. And also, if there's any email questions that you want to fire to us, feel free to do so. But what I would just sort of say about today's webinar, we're giving you a top-line feel across some of the views across the industry. There is an opportunity to ask questions as well. On the GoToWebinar software, there's a panel to the right which has a questions box where you can send those through to our speakers. Feel free to send those as we go through the session. Content will be about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of time for discussion or questions at the end. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Feel free to ask us any questions in any follow-ups. And I'm going to hand over to Vanessa now, who's going to take you through some of the wider consumer landscape and some of our findings on consumer attitudes towards reputational topics. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to take you through consumer trust in British farming and hot reputational topics such as health, environment, and animal welfare. We'll look closely at how views have changed in these categories over the last few years, and then Charlotte will take you through how these have impacted consumption trends. So next slide. So looking at the bigger picture first, before we delve into farming and agriculture, this is a study taken through Blue Marble, and they've conducted research for us over the last 5 years on trust and transparency in the industry. But we just wanted to take this step back and look initially at what's happening going on in the bigger picture. And we can see here, in terms of consumers at the moment, what are their major concerns? And we can see here that over 50% said cost of living is still their major concern in terms of rising energy costs and rising food costs, along with state of the NHS due to the strikes and increased pressure. Closely followed by that, we can see on the right-hand side, the state of the UK economy came up as a key concern too, due to high inflation. There's a new factor that's come in here this year, which is the concerns over river and sea pollution, probably widely because of problems we've experienced recently due to the environment and also press coverage. And then also we've got people do want to eat healthy. They're concerned about how they can eat healthy at an avoidable cost nowadays. Next slide. And then looking in terms of British agriculture over the last 5 years, we can see that it's good news. The majority of UK citizens feel positive about British agriculture and what we're doing at the moment. And in terms of 62% say they feel positive about this. We can see looking back to 2020, it was slightly higher at 66%, but I really do feel this was the COVID effect and when there was a greater focus on the supply chain and people had more time to focus and were slightly more concerned. And next slide. So in terms of trust, we wanted to know whereabouts farmers sit within their profession, within comparable professions nowadays. And we can see here, again, it's good news that farmers actually ranked, 71% of consumers ranked farmers trustworthy. And this is alongside doctors and teachers. And we can, we recognise that teachers are seen and doctors are seen as experts in their fields and people you would turn to for advice. And we can see here that farmers are well ahead of other professions. So yeah, I'd be pretty pleased with that. Next slide. So looking closer at this, why are farmers so trusted, and what is it that consumers see that farmers are good at? Well, farmers, they say, are experts in what they're doing and that they care about people. And this has been tracked over the last 5 years. And we can see in terms of experts at what they're doing, 84% rank them as experts in what they're doing. And this is higher than other areas of the food supply chain. So there is definitely the opportunity to communicate with consumers here, which isn't something farmers are normally known for, but we do think this is an opportunity, as farmers are seen as experts, to actually talk directly to the consumers. And this is something that will be touched on later by Charlotte and Carrie. Next slide. So when looking particularly at meat and dairy, at our industry, we've looked now at, we're aware that some consumers are cutting back, certainly not all, because 99% of households are buying meat, fish and poultry and dairy each year. But of those that said they are cutting back, within meat, the top reason they're cutting back is due to cost. Again, this ties back with cost of living crisis. But after cost, it is down to health reasons and environmental and then animal welfare concerns. And in terms of dairy, we can see that cost is a lesser concern for them. It's more centred around health and then followed by lactose intolerance and allergies. So there's a different sway there between the two, between meat and fish and poultry and dairy. Next slide, please. And so now we'll go to focus on health. Here we can see this is number of people consuming meals for health reasons. And as we can see, the trend over the last few years has actually taken a bit of a dive here. And this is very closely related to consumer confidence. So we can see here, the first dive is the Brexit uncertainty that surrounded that. Then it started to pick up again, and then we were hit by COVID and the 2 lockdowns. And then consumers, health wasn't their key concern then, so it took a dive. And then more recently, it did start to recover again, and then we hit the cost of living crisis. And as we've said, people are struggling to eat healthily when it comes at an additional cost. Next slide. In a separate study here by AHDB, looking at healthy eating priorities, probably comes as no surprise, but eating more fruit and veg, reducing sugar intake, reducing snacking, and eating a healthy balanced diet, all of their top priorities. Eating a balanced diet fits in very nicely with obviously We Eat Balanced campaign, so that's good news. They also stated though that 13% think eating more protein is good for a healthy diet, and only 9% registered reducing their meat intake was key for a healthy diet. Next slide. So we wanted to focus here in terms of red meat. What are perceptions around meat? And we can see, looking at the right at poultry, but consumers recognise that poultry is a good source of protein and it's key for a healthy, balanced diet. But then we need to look closer at red meat. And what does red meat give us? Red meat is very good for protein, it's a very high source of iron, and it's a very good source of B12. So this really is an opportunity to spread awareness and shout about the benefits, especially B12 and iron. And again, this will be touched on. This is something we've recognised and we've touched on later. Next slide, please. And in terms of dairy, we can see here that the majority of consumers recognise that dairy is good for you. And in terms of it's a good source of calcium, it's enjoyable, it tastes good, and it's a valuable part for everyone in the family for their diet. Next slide, please. And so we're going on now to look closer at the environment. And in terms of the environment, we can see through numerous sources of research that consumers really are aware and really do want to purchase sustainable products and be more sustainable around the home and when shopping. But we can see in this study here, in this graph here, but we can see that actually 45% of consumers are being forced now to choose price above their environmental concerns, which is a real shame. But again, this is driven by cost of living. So there is the desire to do the right thing here, but it can't be at any price. It has to be at an affordable rate. Next slide, please. And looking, how does farming compare within other industries in terms of the environment? We can see here that factories, energy production, they're considered a much more of a concern to the environment than farming. Farming is actually, and food production are low here, which is good news. You know, we're not seen as damaging the environment to the same levels. And interestingly, air travel is up there as a real concern. This is probably more due to the fact for greater net zero communications and also being seen as a luxury rather than an essential need. Okay, next slide, please. Within the trust study that we've conducted, consumers' views remain largely unchanged since 2020, with 46% saying farming has a positive impact on the environment in the UK. This is good news, and the only variation slightly on this is that ages between 35 and 54 and vegetarians are slightly more concerned about the impact of farming on the environment. Of those that are concerned, in our study, it's come out as plastic in packaging, habitat and rainforest destruction, and river pollution are their key concerns. Next slide, please. Following on from these results, Blue Marble ran a key driver analysis to determine how concerned people are about the effects on farming on the environment. And we can see here that 31% agreed that they did have a high level of concern. In this case, going through the analysis, we can see that the key drivers that they were concerned about were methane from livestock, water use in crop production, and food miles. The key results from this very in-depth analysis is that if we want people to be less concerned about the effects of farming on the environment, the key areas to focus on are methane from livestock and water usage. Next slide, please. Now, I'm sure we're all aware there are a lot of buzzwords around at the moment regarding the environment and food production. So we can see here what we've charted here is how many times people have heard about these terms and also their understanding of them. So if we look in the top right-hand corner, we can see that pretty much food-related topics in, for example, organic food, processed foods, plant-based foods, they've been heard of and they're pretty well understood. But if we go more towards the centre in terms of the circle, we can see that the likes of carbon neutral, net zero and carbon offsetting, 50% of consumers have heard of them, but actually a similar number aren't quite sure exactly what they mean. And if we go to the bottom left-hand corner, we can see that in terms of terms like water footprint and regenerative agriculture, they haven't been heard about so much and are very, very much less understood. So there's a real opportunity here to shape and inform people of these terms, and actually make sure they do understand and understand the correct meaning. Next slide, please. So we'll go on now to look at British food and British farming. So a significantly high portion of consumers agree that British farmers are doing a good job, and 54% agree they'll proactively look for British food over and above imported foods. This is predominantly females and those aged 45 plus that are saying this sentiment, but this is good news that people want to buy British. Next slide, please. And there is a sense, we're very aware of rising food prices and people are feeling the pinch, but again, it's good news. They're not blaming farmers for these rising food prices. 43% say that farmers can't do anything about these rising food costs. And they actually see that we're all actually in the same boat. Farmers are incurring greater costs through their business. And actually, they do feel, 44% feel that farmers should receive a fair price for their products. So yeah, we're all in the same boat, and we need to look further through the supply chain. Next slide, please. So we can see here that where there has been a real desire to buy premium foods, meat and organic foods, actually consumers have told us they're actually doing this less nowadays. So they're choosing less premium brand foods. They're going down to standard and value tiers due to the price. They're buying slightly less meat and poultry, again due to price, and organic food price again. But there is the desire to do that. And we can see at the lower end of the scale here, people that are doing more, 28% are buying more British food than imported, and actually 37% are buying more loose food without plastic packaging, again back to environmental concerns, and also they want to reduce their waste. So there are good factors here, and actually both these, the buying British food and the buying loose food, has actually gone up since last year. So that's good news. And now we'll go on and we will look at welfare, as this is very closely linked with British farming. According to a study conducted by IGD, we can see here that 96% of consumers consider freshness of product to be critical in terms of ethics. And this is very closely followed by 83% of shoppers saying that animal welfare is important to them. So it really is, 83% is a very, very high stat. So it is, and we're a nation of animal lovers. And so good animal welfare on its own is not going to drive increased sales, but taste and enjoyment are the key factors. But welfare is really important to British consumers, and also in terms of defending and protecting the reputation of British farming. And next slide, please. And here we've picked up through our studies some of the key terms that consumers have said about farming and welfare. That 60% of consumers agree that dairy farmers are doing a good job looking after their animals. And in another study by YouGov, 67% of consumers believe farming practices in the UK ensure animals are well looked after. 54% of consumers ranked practicing higher standards of animal welfare as the top priority for British farmers, just highlighting how important they see it. And also, there is a need. Consumers have said that they would like to know more information about welfare of animals and provide reassurance about the meat and dairy products sold in UK supermarkets. So I will now hand over to Charlotte, who will take you through what the trends are in the current market. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. So we've just seen that there have been a number of overarching hot topics surrounding British agriculture and food production, But really, we now need to look at how are we translating this into what's going on with consumer demand for red meat and dairy. And then actually, importantly, what opportunities do we believe that there are ahead? So if we move on now to the next slide and start by looking at general consumer confidence, we can see it's actually reached its highest point since the end of 2021, as well as since the cost of living crisis began. And unfortunately, this isn't necessarily that consumers are more positive, but actually they're becoming less negative than they had previously been. And this does really centre around shoppers' overall trust within the industry to keep food prices low as food price inflation does start to slow. If we move on to the next slide, despite this raise in confidence that we have seen over recent months, when we look into research that we conduct with YouGov, we can see that almost half of consumers believe that their finances have got worse in recent months. And when we actually look into how those consumers are planning to combat this, food purchases really do feature quite prominently, both in terms of weekly shops, but also in eating out of home. And these are the top two areas which they do believe that they can cut back in. So let's now have a look at how consumers are changing how they're eating and cooking. And really this is coming down to as a means to save money. So the first point being fewer red meat dishes. If we click perfect, this could be how it is actually being used. So moving away from those protein-centered dishes such as roasts, to including that perhaps more as an ingredient within cuisine cooking. So this could be your Indian or Italian meals, which does mean that smaller volumes are being used, or it could also mean the complete exclusion of red meat from the meal. And this doesn't necessarily mean that it's being replaced by a meat-free product, but we do see more of those naturally meat-free meals starting to creep into consumers' repertoires. So your beans on toast. And we are now seeing that around 35% of evening meals do not actually feature meat in any capacity. And really both the options of reducing or the exclusion of red meat at mealtimes is being used, and this can be a conscious decision by consumers or unconsciously, and this is really that means of reducing the cost at mealtimes. If we now think about lunch boxes, now this means meals which are prepared in home but then eaten out of home. In-home lunches are actually still quite high due to the number of consumers continuing to work from home. However, we are seeing that there is an uplift in those who are returning to going back to the workplace, choosing to take food with them rather than making that purchase out of home. So year on year, we are seeing a 6% uplift, and largely as a cost-saving mechanism. And then finally on this slide, we think about this reducing of food wastage. And it isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is going to be impacting on the volumes of food which is being purchased. And we are seeing that meals are becoming increasingly planned. And this could be as simple as writing out a shopping list and sticking to it, all the way through to planning out every single meal in advance. And as a result, we are seeing more conscious shopping moments really sort of drawing in. But if we now move on to looking at the retail landscape on the next couple of slides, if we click on again, we can see that consumers actually spent more than £23 billion on meat, fish and poultry in the 52 weeks ending 1st of October. And this is an increase of actually almost 10% year on year. However, it is really being driven by inflation. It's the actual volumes which are being purchased decreased by 1.6% year on year. And if we now move on to looking at dairy, we can see that more than £10 billion was spent. However, similar to the MFP category, we are seeing this is being driven by price increases. And, you know, they are almost 16% greater than the same period last year. So let's now dive into having a look at those individual products on this next slide. So if we look at proteins first, over the last year, we can see that spend has increased across the board, while volumes have really decreased for all but chicken. And there is some variability within cuts though, and we are seeing that those cheaper or more versatile cuts such as mince are performing well for both beef and pig meat. And interestingly, we're seeing that marinades and added value lamb products are showing growth year on year. But we are seeing that overall red meats have seen greater volume declines than that for the total MFP category. However, and I think this is important to stress, they are generally outperforming the meat-free category. I am going to caveat this by saying they are slightly different time periods we're looking at on data. But this is a trend that we've been seeing throughout the whole of the year. And as Vanessa touched on earlier, research which we have conducted shows that consumers are more likely to think about the nutritional benefits of meat, but they also are aware and they use it within a meal for its taste and enjoyment reasons, while actually meat-free products don't score so highly in this area. And we are seeing that costs really are that key considerations to consumers at the moment. And if consumers are thinking about cutting back on the protein portion within a meal as a means to save money, the meat-free products don't actually really offer this. And when you consider the average cost of an evening meal, the price difference between one which contains meat and one which contains a meat-free product is only a few pence. So this will be contributing to that overall decline being seen in the meat-free volumes. If we now move on to the dairy category performance, we can see that there is this very similar trend of spending more, but volumes being purchased are reduced. And this is going across almost all the categories. However, interestingly, we are seeing that little bit of uplift there in the dairy-free categories, and I will touch on this in a later slide. So if we move on now, and I'm sure this is really no surprise to anyone, but price is that really influential factor driving these trends. And it's true for both proteins and dairy products. And when we think about those proteins, those which are priced cheaper, such as chicken, they are generally performing better, despite seeing greatest price percentage increases year on year. And the areas which are seeing those greatest volume decreases, so that was your fish and your lamb, have actually seen smaller price increases year on year, but their initial higher starting price points is really what's been negatively impacting on their performance. If we now click to look at dairy, all products are seeing actually greater price increases than that of meat, fish and poultry. And touching on butter, now this is an area which has seen one of the smaller price increases. However, it has seen the greatest decreases in volumes being purchased. And when we look into this, it is a lot of, well, it's twofold really. So we're seeing the average price point of plant-based spreads and margarines, which is actually causing some consumers to switch across. But also, if we think back to earlier in the year, butter saw a lot of negative media attention surrounding pricing. If you think back to Lurpak and the headlines over the pricing of being over £7, and this will have had some negative influence on how consumers think and feel about butter overall, and actually perhaps they could cost save by not purchasing. But if we now go on to thinking about actually what are consumers doing, what are we seeing consumers doing to battle price increases? Instead of seeing them leave a category completely, we are seeing a lot more switching within it. So from a protein perspective, we see that chicken is that clear winner, and it is garnering movement from all of the proteins into it. And then from that dairy perspective, if we look at cheddar in particular, we can see that there's that movement from the more expensive products into cheaper ones. And this can either be staged, such as the mature into mild, or it's almost that jumping movement, so going from the extra mature into mild, and these are being utilised as cost-saving mechanisms. And if we now move on to look at something that Vanessa also touched on, and it was that tier, the importance of tiers. And we are seeing that where consumers are purchasing from is changing, with that movement towards those value tiers evidence for both red meat and dairy. And in research that we had with YouGov, and when we particularly think about those proteins, the quality tier and brand is becoming a less important decision factor for purchase, with increased importance really being put on price. And actually this is proving beneficial for certain retailers. And if we think back to at the start of my slides, where those consumers who are saying that their finances have worsened, almost 60% say that they would look to shop with discounters such as Aldi and Lidl. And this is something that we are actually seeing with an additional 14,000 tonnes of red meat and 26,000 tonnes of dairy products being purchased through these retailers year on year. But if we now have a look onto the food service trends, if we click on again, we can see that, you know, if we look at the out-of-home market over the last 4 years, we haven't really recovered to that pre-pandemic level of consumption, despite we are seeing those year-on-year improvements. And actually, when you dig into it, consumers do have the appetite for wanting to get out and about and eat out of home. So if we look now at actually what are the meals which are being consumed, on the next slide, perfect. Now this is coming as what we class as packs, so these are meals as a whole rather than the actual volume content of the meat within the meal. We can see that year on year, consumers are both spending and buying more meals at home. And I'm sure it would not come as a surprise to say that the proteins which are used in meals that have seen the greatest price increase have also seen the number of meals being purchased decline. And once again, this is really falling on lamb and fish. And we can see that, interestingly, for beef and chicken, well, chicken's seen the smallest increase, and actually there's been a decrease in the average price paid for the meals which contain beef. And this growth is actually coming from that sort of eating out of home, that restaurant type market, rather than for takeaways. And this means that actually these price decreases are perhaps more due to the way that these proteins are included within a menu. So if we think about beef in particular, there's that shift towards those comforting classics such as burgers, and perhaps away from those higher ticket items such as steaks. But if we now move on to something which is completely unique to AHDB, and it's the fact that we have access to actual food service volumes for the red meat, rather than just working from pack data, which we saw in that previous slide. And this means that we can actually provide a much clearer picture as what demand is really looking like, particularly when we combine it with retail data. And it does provide a slightly different picture on the out-of-home market, with pork volumes actually performing better than the pack data would suggest. And beef and lamb actual volumes being slightly behind that where the pack data was indicating. What we are seeing is, despite these strong increases in the out-of-home market for beef and pork, due to the size of the resale market, we are seeing year-on-year declines for all the red meats when you combine them. And this is really largely being driven by prices impacting on that demand. So if we now move on to what do we think we are predicting for the year ahead. And I will say it isn't as completely gloomy as a picture this table might suggest at first glance. We are expecting that there will be growth in the beef and cheese categories, and then pork and milk, which do account for two of the largest categories respectively for red meat and dairy, are going to be holding in line with this year. And what we are then expecting as well for lamb is, whilst it will be a decrease, this is going to be minimal. We will publish actual numbers and full numbers in our agri market outlook of where we think that 2024 will actually net out. So please do keep an eye on our website for that. But what we are thinking is that price is really likely going to be an important factor still. But as we are seeing that this confidence is returning, consumers won't be, it won't be the only influence on what they're purchasing. And this is where some of the work that we do really does come into play. So if we now move on, like we've looked at the insights and we've looked at where our future outlook might be, where is this actually leading us to? And at AHDB, we are always looking for that evidence-based insight, which we can use to not only protect sales, but also improve the long-term image and perceptions around red meat and dairy. And it's really important in getting consumers to feel confident to engage with these categories. So I'm going to take you through some top-line research and case studies which we've been building over the last few years. If we move on now, so we found that a key place to re-engage consumers with red meat is actually in store. So this did form a starting point for our research. And we found that what was really important is a hierarchy of messaging, and this is needed to impact on these attitudes around purchase. And firstly, we found that consumers would be attracted to go into the meat aisle if there was strong inspiration and those strong foodie imagery used. Secondly, we found that if you want to increase engagement at the fixture, you need to have messagings around quality and farming expertise. And if possible, having some greenery, that sort of greenery halo, can be used to create the association with sustainability and health. And then finally, consumers are looking for that reassurance to physically pick up that pack, and that comes with health messaging. And it makes them more likely to want to make that purchase. And actually, we find when you combine these things, it would increase basket size by around 4%. We've also conducted similar research for online and food service, but what I really wanted to share with you today is actually some brand new research. And we only got the results in last week, so you are going to be the first people to hear about it. And this is around meat labelling. So if we move on to the next slide. Great. And we found that, once again, this hierarchy around messaging is actually really important. So firstly, regardless of the protein or cut, packaging which is displaying that really strong foodie imagery was best liked by consumers. And it did make them more likely to want to pick up the packs. So above anything else, this would really be a key recommendation. Secondly, consumers like to have that health messaging very much present. And this really helped give them that confidence in making that purchase, particularly when used in a way that they could actually understand what it meant for them. So perhaps instead of just saying high in vitamin B12, actually explaining what that then means for them. And then finally, shoppers felt reassured by messaging around sustainability. And this was particularly key for consumers looking to cut back on their red meat consumption. But we are really aware that obviously labels, they do have limited space on a pack. So this is actually when using QR codes or point of sale around fixture can be really effective in getting some of these messages across to consumers. Now, we will be coming out with full and detailed report on the results, which we've got from this study, and they will be published on our website shortly. But if anyone is interested in finding out more, please do send us a message in the chat or via email. And we're more than happy to go over any of the research that we have conducted, so please do get in touch. We can move on to the next slide. We're now going to be thinking about what are the key opportunities that we have out there. And reputation is really what is back on the menu. And it is, as Vanessa said, it's really going to be featuring around those key topics of health, environment, Britishness and welfare. So we first will think about health, if we could click for that one. We see that actually, yes, it does take that back seat at times of economic uncertainty, but it is going to start increasing in importance as we see this consumer confidence grow. And so being able to effectively communicate actually how affordable and nutrient dense red meat and dairy products are, as well as they're that great source of protein and vitamins and minerals, is actually really important, not only now in tougher financial times, but as priority shifts away from price. We now go on to thinking about those environmental opportunities next. We've seen that, yes, consumers are more aware of those green and net zero targets that are being set, even if they aren't actually completely aware of what it does mean for farming and food production. So now is a really good time to be working on the environmental credentials of our food, so that we can really start to communicate that to our consumers with confidence. And that is that Britain does produce some of the most sustainable red meat and dairy products in the world. And then finally, if we now focus on that Britishness and welfare, we do know that consumers are just as engaged with the idea of both British produce and buying locally. However, it is around price that is generally hampering on some of this demand. But if we can continue to communicate those really high welfare and production standards, which would really result in the quality of the red meat and the dairy products that we do produce, we can reassure those consumers that, yes, it is okay to be eating red meat and dairy, as well as increase their perceptions around the quality and standards that they do sort of reach, and increase that demand. So I'm now going to leave you with some final points. And it is going to be around that sort of how can we communicate these messages and these insights that we do produce really effectively with consumers. And that is something that actually at AHDB we are very good at. We have an award-winning marketing team who use the insights that we do produce to create those evidence-based campaigns, which they can then really target to consumers. So I'm now going to pass across to Carrie, who's our head of marketing, and she's going to take you through some of the work that they do.
Thanks, Charlotte. I'm Carrie, Head of Marketing, and I'm here to talk through how we translate the insights from the Market Intelligence team into consumer campaigns. Next slide, please. So strategically, our role is to add value back to businesses and to promote to consumers the great products our farmers and processors produce. And we do this in 4 simple steps. Firstly, we work closely with our market intelligence colleagues to gather data and insight, like you've just seen, and we always start with the end user, the consumer, in mind. We use this insight to identify the big opportunities which we translate into the marketing plan and activate that plan across the supply chain from farmers to supermarkets. because when we do this and everybody's involved in collaborating, we see the biggest return on sales. We will then pivot when necessary to deliver short-term volume or sales impact, but we've always also got an eye on unlocking long-term attitudinal change. And that's where AHDB is uniquely placed to look after the perceptions and reputation long-term of our categories. Next slide, please. So key to positioning meat and dairy as part of a healthy and sustainable diet is giving consumers the confidence to enjoy it. And recently we've gone live with 3 campaigns. Just build here. There it is. So we've got our We Eat Balanced, Love Pork and Love Lamb Week campaigns, which we produce in collaboration with industry. And we underpin these campaigns with a positive drumbeat of messaging on our always-on social media. Next build. We also collaborate with processors and retailers to activate campaigns in store and provide the insight to drive a change in the way the products are presented both on fixture and, as Charlotte's just mentioned, also on packaging. And we'll be sharing those insights with industry. Next build, please. Our education team also help upskill teachers to be able to give students the chance to understand, importantly, where their food comes from and also develop the life skill of cooking. And the education team have launched a number of pilots recently, such as free ingredients into schools to support cookery lessons, because we know that that's one of the biggest barriers to those types of lessons being delivered in school, and also supporting farmers to deliver school farm visits. We also work in collaboration with the other partners to build impact and scale in this space and challenge misinformation on behalf of the industry. Next slide, please. So in response to the cost of living crisis, we've pivoted some of our activity to focus on affordability and our Feed the Family for Less Pork campaign, which is currently live, and also our always-on content on beef, lamb and dairy. However, we've also got our eye on the long-term sustainable future of our categories and how we influence consumers in the area of reputation. Next slide, please. So to bring this to life, when developing the pork campaign, it was important to understand our target audience and what makes them tick. And it's actually my birthday today, so being a year older, it's really important to understand particularly the next generation of consumers and Gen Z, and understand that their mindset will be very different to mine. And we can utilise those insights to create bespoke content for younger consumers. And in autumn, we also targeted cash-strapped families and produced affordable but nutritious meal solutions. So as well as the segmentation insight, we also conducted message testing, and the screenshot on the right is just an example of how we tested almost 30 statements across sustainability, value, versatility and health to understand which messages to leverage and which messages had the most appeal by our target audience. Next slide, please. So this translates into the campaign, which showcases the great value and versatility of pork with new tempting recipes that come in under £1.50, and our home economist did a great job at developing new recipes with that specification. So it's just gone live and is appearing on on-demand TV shows such as Great British Bake Off, as well as other programming and YouTube, as well as across social media on Facebook, Instagram and Pinterest, with over 29 million placements. The campaign's also live in 8 supermarket chains with in-store signage and on-pack stickers. Next slide, please. So we also have our We Eat Balanced campaign, which focuses on the reputation of our categories, and this will reach 90% of adults, supported by full-page adverts in targeted newspapers, TV, and our social assets will appear 41 million times. We also have 8 supermarkets supporting, and thanks for the processors on the call that collaborated with activating activity and the stickers on pack. And for the first time, if we just build this slide, we have approval to communicate British, which means we can now be big and bold in championing local British meat and dairy, which is a huge step forward. Next slide, please. Our PR campaigns also utilise key moments in the year to communicate the role of meat and dairy in a healthy diet. For Iron Awareness Week, we conducted a survey that found half of teenage girls had a low iron intake and developed our Striking Iron Women campaign. During the World Cup, which seems a distant memory now, we also ran a survey which found 40% of girls playing football are restricting their diets. So we worked with Anita Asante, an ex-England football player, with our Eat Like a Lioness campaign. 140 national publications ran the story with a combined reach of 500 million. Next slide, please. So we also work hand in hand with the market intelligence team to not only develop campaigns, but importantly, to evaluate them. And the last week Balance campaign delivered significant appeal, and we saw movements on consumer attitudes around the health and the nutrition of meat and dairy. And we asked consumers their thoughts on meat and dairy pre the campaign and post the campaign. Next slide, please. And also importantly, year on year, the campaign continues to reassure consumers about eating meat and using the information to defend their choice. So you can see the positive movement from 2021 to 2023. Next slide, please. And also highlighted in the consumer insight was the trust the consumers place in farmers. So we continue to utilise case studies with farmers, and they perform really strongly and engage consumers. People love to hear from people, and we're also planning more new shoots over the coming months. Next slide, please. So marketing, what next? We will continue to challenge misinformation on your behalf. We all consume social media. So if you see anything that doesn't feel right, you can forward to it to AdCheck. Secondly, we know consumers place a huge degree of trust in our farmers and are genuinely interested in where food comes from and how it's produced. So we'll continue to work with farmers to create content. Consumers are seeking to connect with a face, not a faceless organisation. So we need more farmers to step forward to help build that content. And thirdly, we'll be back on TV in January with a bold and striking new TV campaign and new TV advert, giving meat and dairy a positive voice. And now I'm going to hand back to Steve. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for dropping in. It was your birthday as well, so thank you very much for joining us on your birthday.
No problem.
As you can, thanks to Carrie, Vanessa, and Charlotte. Some fantastic content there, and lots that we covered. I'm sure you appreciate there's lots of insight there, but also lots of more depth that we could have gone to, and we could have probably run this for half the day if we would have been allowed to. But what I wanted to do before we just go on to a couple of questions and discussions, I just wanted to say a reminder almost to everyone listening that the recording for the sessions will be live on the website. We'll look to get that online. We'll also make the slide deck available to anyone that would like it. If you fill out the short feedback form, that will either come on the pop-up after the session, or if you don't miss that, if you miss that, then there'll be an email catch up. Once you fill out that short feedback form, you'll basically get access to the slides, so we know that people like to go back and have a little look at stuff. So yeah, very much thank you for listening. We're just going to cover a couple of questions and comments. So I've kind of scribbled down a couple of notes, and we're getting lots of content coming in, which is great. We've had, if I could just ask, we've got all the speakers back on. Yep, lovely. So we have had a couple of comments about the labelling research, lots of interest there. So I guess just for all the listeners, that, as Charlotte said, yeah, it's going to be available. There's also work that Grace is doing in the team that's going to do a bit of a deep dive analysis there. So that'll be available and published on the website. We had one around sort of, I think it was linked to some of the Buying British stuff around purchase intent and how that links to purchase habits. So I think that's quite an interesting one, because it's quite hard to capture and code up sales of British products within the retail environment. But we do closely monitor import-export numbers as well. So I just wanted to highlight that there's actually an analysis article that got published yesterday on the AHDB website that talked about pork imports increasing and the relationship there between the increased demand in food service that Charlotte highlighted. So I think from that perspective, there's some really good analysis articles and stuff, which I'd probably point towards those as well. And there's one that was published yesterday by Sonia on the pork market that could be really useful to go and have a little look at. A comment question, Vanessa, to you. We had you showed that there was a slide around the impact that it's had about farming and the effects on the environment, and that methane from livestock was really high with consumers. Just is that the same across all the kind of consumer landscape, or does anything else jump out when you look across the board?
Yeah, I just did top line just for all population, but actually when Blue Marble actually delved down into the different consumer groups, it was actually interesting that the Gen Zs, the under 25s, actually their priorities actually came out as plastic use on farms was their top concern, and then closely followed by the loss of native UK species due to farming practices, and then it followed on basically with the same factors, but we think this is generated. Gen Zs very much find their information from social media, so I think it's very much, you know, that they use a different source of information maybe to the older generation, maybe the 45 plus, so what their concerns are very much different to, you know, and they're very much more environmentally concerned than I'd say the older population. So that was quite interesting. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Vanessa. Charlotte, as well, with you highlighted some of the trends for dairy, and you had milk seeing a bit of a volume drop. Any sort of more depth there that you can kind of shed a little bit of light on?
Yeah, so obviously that was really looking at the retail data. So that's only going to be when it's really consumed in home. And if you think people are returning, going back to the offices, it's not going to be capturing any of those hot drinks sort of occasions that they're going to be having there. But it's also, when you think about it, perhaps you've got those consumers. We have seen that coffee shops as a sort of an outlet within the out-of-home market has seen better recovery than a lot of other restaurants or those type of outlets. And it is perhaps that they're going in and picking up those coffees on the way to work rather than making them in home. And that could be sort of influencing on that.
Great, thank you. Carrie, when you were doing your presentations on your slides, we had a couple of comments there. You sort of had it on your last slide, but we just got asked about what AHDB can do to protect the industry from misinformation and challenging stuff. Do you want to just kind of go a little bit further with that, sort of just what you've kind of done in the past and what you continuously do?
Yeah, so there is the email address. So we encourage farmers and members of industry, if you see anything, often, and particularly I'm sure everybody's seen on social media, there's lots of claims possibly made by different companies, or meat and dairy is misrepresented. So if you see anything that's not correct there, please use the email adcheck@ahdb.org.uk. We also, if we see anything, we also work with our industry partners. We will write letters and try and balance that misinformation and balance kind of the narrative. We obviously have our campaigns which proactively go out and tell a positive story, and we kind of horizon scan what's in the public domain, and the insight is important to that, so we can balance some of that narrative.
Great, thanks, Carrie. We've also had a comment through from a pig farmer that sort of says about, obviously, not just supermarkets, they'd love to be involved and sort of get content for some of the things you put in store. How could, if you're kind of a farmer and you want to get involved with your campaigns and kind of join us on that communication, how could they get involved?
Well, we produce a number of farm banners throughout the year, so if you're interested in having those outside the farm, you can utilise those. We also have social media packs as well, so if you have any online presence, you can also utilise pre-made assets which are approved, so you can just put those out there. If you're really, really keen, we're always looking for farmer case studies, farmers who are happy to appear on camera, and we can send a professional crew down, film the good work that you're doing on your farm, and help to get the message and the story of British farming out there.
Great. Okay, I won't call them out live on this webinar, but you've obviously heard that from Carrie, so hopefully that helps answer the question. And any other listeners that are out there in terms of catching up on the webinar that want to get involved from a farmer, sounds like there's lots of fantastic opportunities. We had a comment through on when we were talking about lamb, and we haven't mentioned halal. So I guess from the halal perspective, just to kind of add, there's actually lots going on behind the scenes that we've run a couple of on-farm workshops and presentations out with the industry. We recognise that it is a really important segment, where certainly for lamb consumption. We're actually just doing a piece of research, or we're just about to start a piece of research over the next few months on halal consumer trends and consumer insights. So Vanessa, you're actually kind of started that off, aren't you? So you're working really closely with the industry there. So if there is any participation or insight gaps, we'd love to actually to drop that on an email to us. It could be a really good timing as well for that.
And also, just to build on that, Steve, we ran a halal campaign in September. So that was working with young halal influencers, communicating the role of lamb and how it can be utilised throughout the week in midweek meals.
Lovely. Yeah. And then we had a couple of comments just on some of the earlier slides that Vanessa showed, just about sort of like where we were talking about the top 2 boxes in some of the content, and there was a question or comment saying, isn't the top box the most important? It is, and we also track that, and we look at lots of cross breaks in there. So I think there's probably lots more analysis that we could show as well. So I'd probably sort of like say, if you're interested in more depth behind the scenes of some of these points, then it's a fantastic way to get in touch with us and engage with us in terms of the content. We could go into lots more depth. So I'm conscious of time, and it's probably a sign that we've had some really good kind of questions and discussions, and you've covered lots of ground to the speaker. So I just want to say a massive thank you again to everyone for listening, but also for the speakers for today. There's lots of work that goes behind the scenes for pulling this content together, and I'm hopefully provided you with lots more insight about what you've got available. So I'm going to just wrap up by sort of reminding people really that there's lots of content on our website. We do actually have a bi-monthly Consumer Insight newsletter. It's actually a really good prompt to kind of sign up and keep in touch with us, and you get like a little bit of a nudge every couple of months there about like latest insight pieces and latest analysis. So if you're not already signed up, then I would probably say that is a really great way of just getting that kind of one-step sign up and keeping in touch with us. And there was obviously our email address and web content, so feel free to come back to any of the analysts. If we've not got to your question, or I've not covered it in this last section, can I just sort of say we'll go back through the questions raised, and if we haven't covered it at any point, we'll kind of drop people an email back to try and hopefully point them in the right direction or help provide a little bit more clarity. So we'll look to do that over the next few days or early next week. So thanks again for tuning into this webinar, and thanks again for today's speakers. The catch up to this session, if people want to play back, feel free, we'll be hosted on the website. If not, share with friends or colleagues in the industry. We know that sometimes attending live events can be difficult, but we know that the link in past years has been really valuable that people have caught up with online. So thank you very much, and thanks again for the speakers, and have a good rest of the day, everyone.